Well, thank you. It really is an honor to be able to be here with you today, and I also understand that I'm what is standing between you and lunch. So I will keep this uncharacteristically short for a senator to be able to go through some issues, but I want to be able to walk through multiple issues with you and be able to talk about the status of where we are, where we're going, what still needs to be done, and what is currently being done, and why this principle is so incredibly important. You spent the day on an issue that many people ignore over time, or just assume it's always going to be there. But unless this freedom is actually protected, unless it's guarded, it can slip away in incremental ways. So it's important to be able to have this dialogue. I do thank the Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, as well, for the work and for what you have already done, for inviting me here not only to be a part of this event, but for hosting this event, and for establishing the Religious Liberty Task Force, which will be extremely important in the days ahead. So let me set the stage for you when we talk about religious liberty with a hypothetical Friday night. As many of us across the country, we start getting towards the middle of summer, and all we think about in the middle of summer is fall is coming, and if fall is coming, that means football season is coming, right? So let me set the stage of a painful Friday night. A high school football player takes a direct hit to the head during a homecoming game. Lays there motionless, unconscious, on the 35-yard line as the trainers and the local EMTs from their town rush out to the middle of the field and try to provide care. Players on the sidelines spontaneously, along with some of the coaches, kneel down on the sidelines and bow their head. And they watch as the player is put on a backboard and carried away in an ambulance. The next week, here is my question. Should the coaches that kneeled down on the sideline and silently bowed their head as the player was being carried off on a backboard, should they be fired next week? It's not so far-fetched and not so radical of a statement. In 2015, there was a gentleman that was the assistant coach at Bremerton, Washington High School that after the games were over would kneel down after the game was done and thank God that no player was injured. And he would silently pray for just a few moments, thanking God no one was injured. So should the United States view the silent prayer of someone in gratitude for no one being injured different than a silent prayer while someone is injured? Would that same individual be treated differently? The court so far has allowed Coach Kennedy to be fired from his job because he dared, after the football game was over, not during official time, but after the game was over, to kneel down and silently pray. It's a bigger question for us. What if this was a Muslim coach who was going to pray 5 times a day? And there were times that some of the players would come and join him who were also Muslim, that during the practice time would slip away and to be able to silently pray. Would that be permissible? What if there was a coach or a teacher that had a beard of a certain length, or a turban, or a cap, or a cross, or a Star of David necklace? Is the issue really that a person who works for government and within the government cannot have any display of faith at any time that any person could ever see that and notice that? Well, there are governments that have come to that agreement. One of them is the Chinese government. They've taken that stand, and they've stated that they can require any person to have a certain time or place that they can actually practice their faith, that they can get a certain permit, and they have to have supervision to make sure that there's good order in that time of worship. In fact, they've moved so far as to be able to remove any outside symbol from a house of worship so that if anyone travels through a city, they won't have the perception that the government allows certain religions and don't allow other religions, so there wouldn't be any knowledge that there would be a preference for a certain religion. Chinese government's done that. The Russian government has stepped up and they've banned groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, Scientology, or certain types of Muslims. They've banned conversion in any place that's not approved by the Russian government for a place of conversion. You can change your faith, but only at a place or a time or a setting that the Russian government allows you to be able to change your government. And the obvious chilling messages to people of faith in Russia is that your faith is allowed by the government. And at any point, the government could choose to not allow your faith. In India right now, there's a constitutional protection for religious liberty, except that some states in India also have blasphemy laws that are currently on the books, and that's being ignored. And the Turkish government that prided itself on religious liberty just a decade ago, in the last 2 years has had a dramatic change in the issue of religious freedom. We have a pastor, Dr. Andrew Brunson, who's an American pastor, who's been serving in Turkey for now 24 years. The last 2 of those, though, he's been serving in prison. USERV, in their 2018 report, which you've highlighted multiple times during this conversation today, in just the introduction, they said there's an ongoing downward trend, often intersected with authoritarian practices characterized by hostility towards dissent, pluralism, independent media, active civil society, or took place under the guise of protecting national security of countering terrorism. In short, they're saying religious freedom in the world is diminishing, not expanding. We in the United States have a decision to make. As we continue to expand religious liberty and to be able to look at this issue, we're answering for the world and we're demonstrating to the world how it can be done. How people with different faiths can be common citizens and have unity in our citizenship and diversity in our faith and our backgrounds and our culture. Most of the world is still watching us to see if religious freedom can really work. There are billions of people around the world that are hoping we can make this work, because the future for their children and their grandchildren will be determined by that. If not, they will live their faith suppressed by a desperate government who feels an obligation to reach into a person's innermost soul and mind and determine for them what they can and cannot do, and also what they can and cannot think. So let me just clarify, when I say faith, everyone has their own perspectives and backgrounds, but in a broader perspective, when I say faith, I think of what affects your life and your decision making the most. Because some people have a religion. It's a cultural thing for them, based on their background, or based on their family or their community. Quite frankly, their religion is something they just check on a box. If they ever get a form that has a diversity of backgrounds on it, they know which one they're going to check because they have a certain religion. But a personal faith is something that goes much deeper than just a chosen statement of a religious preference on a box. A personal faith is not something you take on and off. It's not something the government can reach into you and try to eliminate or change. It is the personal faith that you have. It what affects your decision making. It affects how you treat another person, even a person you disagree with. It affects how you interact with your family. It even affects how you drive. It affects who you are. It is your faith. It's not something you can take on and off. I tell people often that talk about their religion that it really is something they do on weekends. I'll typically smile at them and I'll say, well, if your religion is something you do on weekends, that's not really a faith. Something you only do on weekends is called a hobby. For many Americans, they don't have a religion they take on and off on weekdays and weekends. They have a faith that permeates every single day of their life. It's not their hobby, it's who they are. It's the deepest part of them. So the simple question for our nation is, do we allow people to have a faith or just a religious preference? Do we allow the freedom of worship or the free exercise of religion? It's not a new question for Americans, quite frankly. It's a question we struggle with since before we were even a nation. As has been mentioned already, in 1786 in the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinion in matters of religion." In 1784, Madison wrote, dealing with a law that was coming through the Virginia House at that point, that was going to force taxation for the public education for Christianity. Madison wrote, by the way, he wrote anonymously, "All men are by nature equally free and independent. All men are to be considered as entering into society on equal conditions, as relinquishing no more and therefore retaining no less one than another of their natural rights. Above all, are they to be considered as retaining an equal title to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. Whilst we assert for ourselves a freedom to embrace, to profess, and to observe the religion which we believe of divine origin, we cannot deny an equal freedom to those whose minds have not yet yielded to the evidence which has convinced us. It's a great statement. During the time of the American Revolution, King George III was the head of the church and the head of the state, and he could determine which faith and which place would be there. In fact, during that same time period in 1774, many of you may remember the Quebec Acts that actually gave Catholicism to the province of Quebec in 1774. That though they weren't going to be under the Church of England anymore, they could be independent in their faith and to be considered a Catholic state. He could do that because the king was the head of the state and was the head of the church. Many of the colonies had an official religion. This wasn't something that was hypothetical to us. We had seen it from our foundations. And there was a declaration that if you're going to have unity as a country, everyone has to have the same faith. We challenge that. And as striking as it is, we're still challenging that. And we're still making progress on something over 2 centuries old. Let me give you some ways that we've done that recently. May the 4th, 2017, President Trump issued an executive order directing the Department of Justice to issue guidance interpreting religious liberty and their protections under law. The Department of Justice has helped governments, has helped many entities within our government protect religious liberty since that time period and to step in. FEMA disaster aid can now go to houses of worship. This has always seemed like an odd argument to me, that if the library was destroyed in a disaster, they could get disaster assistance. But if a mosque down the street was also destroyed in that disaster, they could not. Or a synagogue could not. Or another house of worship could not. Though one was a nonprofit and the other one was a nonprofit, by definition, the government in the past had discriminated against one over the other one because one had faith and one did not make their faith public if they had it. But if you dared to make your faith public, then you couldn't get FEMA disaster aid until this past year. And that's finally been changed. The EEOC versus Abercrombie case was a great case determining, can an employer use in hiring their refusing to hire someone because they don't want to accommodate their religion. And in an 8-1 decision, they determined that no, an employer can't say, I don't want to accommodate their religion, and so I'm just not going to hire them. That's religious discrimination on its face. Sam Brownback continues to be able to work with people around the world right now as our ambassador at large for religious liberty, and to be able to work towards asking a simple question: what are we doing promoting this essential American value around the world? There are faith-based offices in each executive agency with a liaison in the White House office. Many of you are here today. You're not creating new policy for Americans, you're protecting a very old policy. That people can not only have a faith, but they can live their faith. You heard earlier today from Jack Phillips himself on the Masterpiece Cake Shop, a very important Supreme Court case determining, can government be hostile to religion, and can government acknowledge what we should all know? We can respect the dignity of all people around the issues that divide us and still respect those individuals. Now you've added the Religious Liberty Task Force chaired by the Attorney General himself. There are things that are ongoing that we can do, and we should do, and we continue to do. Let's stay on it. We still have work to do by clarifying individuals and groups like the Little Sisters of the Poor. Can they have a health plan that honors their faith? We still need to protect organizations that right now are unwilling to compete for federal contracts because they're afraid they'll go through the whole process and then be discriminated against at the end because they're a faith-based organization. Even though we've already had recent Supreme Court cases saying the government cannot discriminate against someone because they have faith or withhold a grant from them simply on the fact that if they would surrender their faith, then they could have the grant. That's not leverage against a group to sacrifice your faith. But we still have groups that fail to be able to even apply for fear there's still discrimination there. We still have colleges that try to reach in and change, force a change in faith-based organizations on campus saying if you don't change not just your membership, but your leadership and your bylaws, we will not accept you on a state campus. We still have work to be done. We still have work to be done in the military, because at times people hide behind the term good order and discipline as a catch-all phrase rather than being the least inhibited to be able to allow people to be able to live their faith, realizing that for now two plus centuries we've allowed chaplains in the military because we're asking people to be able to step away from their normal places and times, and we still provide religious services for them. We still need to pass in Congress the Conscience Protection Act. We still need to pass the Child Welfare Providers Inclusion Act. We still need, quite frankly, to be able to work on something as simple as something called the Johnson Amendment. Johnson Amendment is such an interesting thing. It puts in our law the ability for the government to reach in and add additional tax to a nonprofit entity if they dare to speak out against a government official. Where else in our law do we have that? The ability to say you're a nonprofit and you can only stay a nonprofit if you don't speak out against a particular government official. In our nation, we have freedom of speech, and we have the rights for individuals to be able to live their faith. And if at time a nonprofit group has an issue with an elected official, they should be able to speak out against that. They can speak out about issues, just not about people. At some point, that needs to be fixed. We have issues that still need to be resolved. Going back to Madison again. Madison made an interesting statement. He talked about our faith as our possession, not just our possession, as our innermost, most precious possession. Madison said conscience is the most sacred of all property, other property depending in part on positive law, the exercise of that being natural and unalienable right. To guard a man's house as his castle, to pay public and enforce private debts with the most exact faith, can give no title to invade a man's conscience, which is more sacred than his castle. Just because government disagrees with a person's faith doesn't mean they have the right to step in and say, it offends me, and so you have to change. That would be the equivalent if I had a Jeff Sessions painting hanging up in my house with him wearing a Georgia Bulldog sweatshirt on it. It may offend him deeply, but he doesn't have the right to come take away my painting just because he doesn't like it. And just because someone in government says, I don't particularly like that faith and the teachings of that faith, doesn't give them the right to step in and take away a person's property, their most innermost protected possession, their belief. We as a government don't tell people what they can and can't do. We certainly don't believe what we step into someone and say what you can and cannot believe. Religious liberty doesn't exist because there's an America. Quite frankly, America exists because of religious liberty. This value that we have held for over 2 centuries has kept us diverse and protected people in their rights to believe. We cannot lose this first freedom. It continues to take work and protection. Let's pass it on. Let's continue to tweak it. Let's continue to argue and disagree about it. But let's continue to be able to protect the rights of our neighbors to believe something different than what we believe. Quite frankly, the only time that a person should push back on their neighbor's belief is that they're insecure in their own. Let's live out what we believe. And let's allow our neighbor to do the same. We can do that as Americans. And we can set the pace for the rest of the world because there are billions of people that are desperately hoping for this freedom that we have the obligation to both protect and to promote. Thanks for participating in this long day. As you sneak away to be able to grab lunch, I hope you'll find it's worth it for the day to get a refreshing conversation about this first freedom. Thanks you all very much.